Odin gazed down at the ragged human survivors with a glare of pure alien disgust. His superior Gamelon weapons pointed at Keith Gordon's head, ready to exterminate humanity's last pathetic remnants. Keith, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, rallied the bedraggled humans behind makeshift barricades as they prepared for what seemed like their final hopeless stand. They were outgunned, outclassed, and on the verge of utter extinction by the ruthless alien oppressors. But a flicker of hope remained. Desperate for any chance at survival, Keith had stumbled upon an ancient human outpost buried deep in the planet's caverns. There, he discovered a mysterious relic weapon, a powerful device from a bygone era that could potentially turn the tide against the Gamelons. The weapon was old and damaged, but it was humanity's last shot. As the Gamelon warships descended through the hazy sky, Keith raced against time to unlock the relic weapon's secrets and repair its decrepit systems. Odin sneered with contempt, proclaiming the Gamelons as the universe's rightful rulers, while dismissing humans as lowly vermin to be exterminated. He was confident that his force's advanced alien tech would effortlessly crush the primitive humans. But Odin didn't know about the ancient weapon. As Keith feverishly worked to bring the relic back online, he knew everything depended on this. The entire future of the human species hinged on this one final battle. This remote planet was humanity's last refuge among the stars, and the relic weapon was their only hope against a far superior adversary, hell-bent on their annihilation. Laser blasts lit up the settlement's perimeter as the Gamelon troops unleashed their opening salvo. Keith's hands shook as he frantically tried to awaken the damaged relic, knowing that without it, they were all doomed. The air smoldered with smoke and death as the aliens advanced. Human screams mixed with Gamelon war cries, a cacophony punctuated by the crackle of energy weapons. The ground grew slick with blood, both human and alien. With the enemy closing in and humanity's time fast running out, Keith made one final desperate attempt to activate the ancient human weapon. The fate of his species, the survival of everything he held dear, it all came down to this pivotal moment. Keith's hands flew across the ancient control console, ignoring the sting of electrical burns as he frantically rewired the relic weapon's power systems. The Novasite crystal pulsed with an ethereal glow, flooding the decrepit machine with fresh energy. "Keith!" Marcus shouted over the cacophony of humming machinery and distant explosions. He stumbled towards his friend, one hand pressed against the bloody bandage covering his abdomen. "Let me help." "Marcus, you're in no condition." "I'm not dead yet," Marcus said, his eyes hard with grit. "I can still fight. I need to fight." Keith hesitated for a moment before nodding. Together, they delved into the relic's intricate systems, coaxing the ancient technology back to life. Outside, the ground shook as Gamelon dropships strafed the settlement's perimeter. Energy blasts tore through the ramshackle buildings, sending debris and bodies flying. The human defenders returned fire with scavenged weapons, their shots bouncing harmlessly off the Gamelon's advanced armor. "Odin's warship is entering the atmosphere," a scout reported, her voice tinged with panic. Keith's eyes locked onto the view screen, watching as the massive Gamelon vessel descended through the clouds like a monstrous bird of prey. Its weapons already glowed with deadly promise. "We're out of time," Keith said, his voice grim. "We need to move the relic weapon now." Marcus nodded, his face pale but resolute. They disconnected the final power couplings and heaved the bulky device onto a hovering transport. Keith gathered a small team of fighters, their faces etched with a mix of fear and tenacity. They raced through the settlement's narrow streets, the relic weapon in tow. Gamelon soldiers poured from the dropships, their energy rifles spitting death. Keith and his team fought back with savage ferocity, their weapons barking and blades flashing in the smoky air. Marcus staggered behind, his breathing labored. He clutched a battered rifle in his hands, covering their retreat with short, controlled bursts. A Gamelon soldier leaped from a ruined building, his weapon aimed at Keith's exposed back. Marcus didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, shoving Keith aside as the energy blast seared through his chest. Keith caught Marcus as he fell, cradling his friend's broken body in his arms. "Marcus, hold on. We're almost there." Marcus coughed, blood bubbling from his lips. You have to finish this, Keith. Use the weapon. Make them pay for what they've done to us. I will, Keith promised, his voice choked with grief. I swear it. Marcus smiled, his eyes drifting shut. Give 'em hell, brother. With a final shuddering breath, Marcus went still in Keith's arms. Keith bowed his head, hot tears mixing with the dirt and blood on his face. Around him, the battle raged on. But for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Keith, we need to keep moving, one of the fighters urged, desperation in his voice. Keith laid Marcus down gently, his heart made with renewed perseverance. He rose to his feet, the relic weapon looming behind him like a silent guardian. They reached the outskirts of the settlement, a clear stretch of ground offering a direct line of sight to the approaching Gamelon warship. Keith and the remaining fighters took up defensive positions around the relic weapon, their weapons trained on the sky. Pathetic humans, Odin's voice boomed from the warship's external speakers. You only delay the inevitable. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Keith's fingers danced across the relic weapon's control panel, his eyes hard as flint. Odin! He shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield. You want to surrender? Here's my answer. The relic weapon hummed to life, ancient circuits surging with power. Keith aimed the barrel towards the Gamelon warship, the crosshairs locking onto the massive vessel's hull. Fire! Keith roared, banging his hand down on the activation button. The relic weapon shuddered as it unleashed a blinding beam of energy, the air crackling with ozone. The beam punched through the Gamelon warship's shields, slicing into the vessel's armored hide like a surgical laser. Explosions blossomed along the warship's hull, secondary detonations ripping through its internal systems. Odin's voice dissolved into a garbled scream as the once mighty vessel began to break apart, consumed by the ancient weapon's unstoppable power. The relic weapon swept across the battlefield, vaporizing Gamelon soldiers and reducing their advanced war machines to molten slag. Odin's army, caught completely off guard by the sudden onslaught, broke ranks and fled, their arrogance shattered in the face of the human resistance's unyielding spirit. As the smoke cleared, Keith stood amidst the ruins of the settlement, the relic weapon thrumming with barely contained energy at his side. The surviving humans emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mix of awe and grief. They had won the battle, but the cost had been high. Keith's gaze drifted to where Marcus had fallen, his heart heavy with the weight of his friend's sacrifice. But as he looked out over the gathered survivors, their eyes bright with newfound hope, Keith knew that Marcus's death had not been in vain. This is only the beginning, Keith said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. The Gamelons think they can break us, but they're wrong. We have the power to fight back now, and we will not rest until every last human settlement is free from their tyranny. The survivors raised their weapons in a defiant salute, their voices joining together in a resounding cheer. Keith turned to face the stars, the relic weapon humming with promise at his side. The road ahead would be long and bloody, but for the first time in years, humanity had a chance to reclaim its destiny. Keith stood before the ragged group of survivors, his eyes blazing with a fierce drive. We've struck a blow against the Gamelons, but we can't stop now. It's time to take the fight to them. The assembled fighters murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of hope and trepidation. Keith hefted the relic weapon, its ancient circuits humming with latent power. This weapon gave us an edge, but its energy is limited. We need to use it wisely, to hit the Gamelons where it hurts most. Marcus, his chest still bandaged from the previous battle, stepped forward. What's the plan, Keith? Keith unrolled a crude map on a makeshift table. Intelligence suggests the Gamelons have a central command hub here, he said, pointing to a location deep in enemy territory. If we can infiltrate it and use the relic weapon to disable their war coordination systems, we could cripple their entire operation. The group crowded around the map, studying the treacherous path that lay ahead. Keith began assembling his strike team, selecting the settlement's most skilled fighters and sharpest minds. As they prepared to depart, Keith pulled Marcus aside. Are you sure you're up for this? Marcus nodded, his fists tight. I'm not sitting this one out, Keith. We started this fight together and we'll finish it the same way. The team boarded their battered transport ship, the relic weapon secured in a reinforced hold. As they lifted off, leaving the smoldering ruins of their settlement behind, Keith felt the weight of their mission settle on his shoulders. Days turned into weeks as they navigated the dangerous expanse of space. They dodged Gamelon patrols, their ship's aging stealth systems barely keeping them hidden. At times, they were forced to make emergency landings on desolate planetoids to avoid detection. During one such stop, they encountered a group of human resistance fighters. The meeting was tense at first, with weapons drawn on both sides, but soon gave way to cautious alliance. We've heard whispers about a weapon that could turn the tide, said the resistance leader, eyeing the relic. Looks like the rumors were true. The resistance fighters shared valuable intelligence about Gamelon movements and offered additional supplies. With each encounter, their ranks swelled and their grit strengthened. As they neared Gamelon space, the team intercepted an encrypted transmission. Keith's blood ran cold as he decoded the message. Odin's alive, he announced to the group, and he's rallying his forces for a massive counterattack. We're running out of time. The Gamelon command hub loomed before them, a fortress of gleaming metal and pulsing energy fields. Using salvaged Gamelon tech and desperate cunning, they managed to slip past the outer defenses. Inside, they crept through sterile corridors, their hearts pounding with each step. Suddenly, alarms blared. They'd been detected. Marcus, take a team and hold them off, Keith shouted over the din. We need to reach the central core. Marcus nodded, leading a group down a side passage. The sound of weapons fire echoed through the hub as Keith and the others pressed on. They fought their way deeper into the facility, each chamber more heavily guarded than the last. Keith's team was battered but unbroken, driven by the knowledge that failure meant extinction for their species. As they neared the command center, Keith heard Marcus's voice crackle over the comm. Keith, we can't hold them much longer. Keith's throat tightened as he heard the sounds of battle intensify. Then Marcus's voice again, weaker this time. Complete the mission, Keith, no matter what. The comm went silent. Keith closed his eyes for a moment, grief threatening to overwhelm him. Then he squared his shoulders and motioned his team forward. They burst into the command center, weapons blazing, and there, amidst the chaos, stood Odin himself. The Gamelon leader sneered at Keith. You've come far, human, only to die here. Your species is doomed. Accept your fate. Keith raised the relic weapon. Stand down, Odin, or I'll use this to blow this entire facility to dust. Odin laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Your primitive weapon cannot penetrate our defenses. Your threats are as empty as your future. A grim smile spread across Keith's face. Who said anything about blowing it up? He activated the relic weapon. Instead of a destructive blast, it emitted a pulse of energy that swept through the command hub. Suddenly, every screen went dark. Alarms fell silent. The Gamelon's weapons sputtered and died. Odin's eyes widened in shock as he realized the true nature of the weapon. What have you done? We've leveled the playing field, Keith said, advancing on the Gamelon leader. Odin barked orders into his comm unit, but received only static in response. With a snarl of rage, he fled the command center, shouting for his forces to retreat. Keith's team worked quickly, securing the hub and using its systems to broadcast a message to resistance cells across the galaxy. The Gamelons are vulnerable, Keith announced. The time to strike is now. As the message went out, Keith stood at the hub's main console, the relic weapon pulsing with energy beside him. He knew the war was just the beginning, but for the first time in living memory, humanity had hope. A real chance at victory. The air crackled with anticipation as Keith addressed the gathered resistance fighters. We've struck a blow against the Gamelons, but our fight is just getting started, Keith said, his voice carrying across the makeshift command center. It's time to take the offensive. The room buzzed with activity as resistance members from various cells across the galaxy coordinated their efforts. Holographic displays flickered to life, showing the positions of known Gamelon strongholds and potential targets. "We've received intel from our operatives on Centauri Prime," a young resistance fighter reported, her eyes glued to a datapad. "The Gamelons are scrambling to regroup their forces." Keith nodded, studying the tactical display. "They're vulnerable. We need to strike now before they can recover." As the resistance mobilized for their counteroffensive, an urgent transmission cut through the chatter. Keith's blood ran cold as he deciphered the message. "Odin's targeting the Epsilon colony," he announced, his face grim. "They're planning to make an example of them." The room fell silent, the weight of the news settling on everyone's shoulders. Epsilon colony was home to over 1 million humans, including many families with young children. "We can't let that happen," Jenna, Keith's second-in-command, said firmly. Keith ran the numbers in his head, his heart sinking. "Our main force won't arrive in time," he said. "But we can't abandon those people." He made a split-second decision, one that could cost him everything. "I'm taking a small team to Epsilon. We'll use the relic weapon to buy time for evacuation." Protests erupted from the gathered resistance members, but Keith silenced them with a raised hand. "This isn't up for debate. Jenna, you'll lead the main force. We'll hold out as long as we can." Within hours, Keith's strike team was racing towards Epsilon Colony in a retrofitted Gamelon scout ship. As they dropped out of hyperspace, the sight that greeted them stole the breath from their lungs. Massive Gamelon warships loomed over the colony, their weapons raining destruction on the planet's surface. Fires raged across the landscape, and the once pristine cityscape was now a maze of rubble and chaos. Keith gripped the controls tightly as he piloted the ship through the maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire. "We're going in hot," he shouted over the roar of the engines. "Brace for impact." The ship shuddered as they touched down hard on the outskirts of the colony's central district. Keith and his team spilled out, weapons at the ready. "Move!" Keith ordered, leading the charge towards the colony's command center. They fought their way through the streets, engaging Gamelon troops at every turn. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning plastics. Screams and weapons fire echoed off the crumbling buildings. As they neared the command center, Keith spotted a group of civilians huddled in the ruins of a collapsed storefront. Among them were several children, their eyes wide with terror. "Change of plans," Keith said, motioning to his team. "Get these people to safety. I'll handle the relic weapon." His team began herding the civilians towards a nearby shelter, but one figure remained behind. Talia, a seasoned warrior and one of Keith's most trusted allies, stood her ground. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," she said, her voice firm. Keith wanted to argue, but there was no time. They rushed into the command center, the relic weapon humming with power between them. As they set up the weapon, the building shook with the impact of Gamelon artillery. Keith's fingers flew over the controls, priming the ancient device for action. "Incoming!" Talia shouted, as the first wave of Gamelon troops breached the command center's defenses. Keith activated the relic weapon, and a surge of energy pulsed outward. The Gamelon soldiers crumpled, their advanced tech rendered useless by the ancient power. But the victory was short-lived. More Gamelons poured in, adapting their tactics. They focused their fire on the relic weapon's position, the air thick with energy blasts. Talia saw the danger before Keith did. As a concentrated burst of Gamelon fire streaked towards him, she leapt into its path. "Talia!" Keith cried out as she collapsed, her body smoking from the blast. He cradled her in his arms, his heart pounding. Talia looked up at him, her eyes already growing dim. "Keep fighting, Keith," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Despite the toll." With a final, shuddering breath, Talia went still. Keith felt a wave of grief threaten to overwhelm him, but he forced it down. There would be time to mourn later, if he survived. Keith turned back to the relic weapon, his face set in grim lines. He poured every ounce of his rage and sorrow into the device, unleashing devastating blasts that kept the Gamelon forces at bay. But it wasn't enough. The enemy kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Keith's fingers hovered over the relic weapon's self-destruct sequence, a last, bold strategy. Just as he was about to activate it, a familiar voice crackled over his comm unit. "Keith, do you read? This is Jenna. The cavalry has arrived." Keith looked up to see human ships filling the sky, engaging the Gamelon fleet in a fierce battle. On the ground, fresh resistance troops poured into the city, pushing back against the alien invaders. The tide of battle shifted, and soon the Gamelons were in full retreat. As the sounds of combat faded, Keith slumped against the relic weapon, exhaustion and relief washing over him in equal measure. Jenna found him there, surrounded by the aftermath of the brutal fight. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the fallen Gamelons, the destruction, and the quiet form of Talia lying nearby. "Keith," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "it's over. We've won." He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "At what cost?" he asked. Keith struggled to his feet, the relic weapon's core now dark and lifeless in his hands. He looked out over the ruined cityscape, thinking of Marcus, Talia, and all the others who had given their lives in this war. "We can't let their sacrifices be in vain," Keith said, his voice gaining strength. "We keep fighting until every human world is free." Jenna nodded, her face set with fierce.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.